Tulsa Tyrant asks a totally reasonable question. Do you think a show like Mythbusters could garner the same audience today as it did from 2003 on, or maybe even a larger one? You know, look, the fact is that Mythbusters had a really impressive bell curve of its popularity because it went up very quickly to an extremely high rating for cable at the time in 2003, getting almost a 2 share a couple of times, which is like 2 million people watching, which at that point was gargantuan, even for cable. And then our viewership stayed really consistent from 2003 until probably about 2000 and late 2011. 8 years. 8 years kind of getting great ratings all the freaking time. And then they just slowly started to decline. And I always knew they would. Everything travels in a bell curve. But I think Mythbusters was absolutely of its time. So I don't think that Mythbusters would enjoy a humongous popularity right now. A different show, these things happen and it's not like Mythbusters showed up in culture. It's like culture and Mythbusters formed each other at that moment. That's what lasting stuff does. It shows up and it's part of the culture. Mythbusters was responding to the culture. And we grew up alongside the maker movement and rapid prototyping, 3D printing. All that started happening at roughly the same time. And at the same time, social media shows up. YouTube and Twitter did not exist when we started doing Mythbusters. And yet they became super, super important to putting the shows together once it was going. It's the longest way of saying, I never took it personally that our ratings went down. That was always something that, I knew was going to happen. And I don't wish that Mythbusters could be a big hit today. The fact of its success is totally astounding even now to me. We shot the pilots with 6 people. That really doesn't happen anymore in television. And maybe it should, frankly. But again, what is television anymore, right? I'm no longer on television. I'm on your YouTubes, right? The way of disseminating and making content is shifting. And so when I say nobody does that in television anymore, yeah, there are people who make great things with 6-person crews, and Tested is one of them. We're exactly a 6-person crew. And I think we're doing great. I'm really, really happy with what we make and how we make it. And there's an intimacy to this that we wouldn't get out of a 25 or 30-person crew. And I think the small crews that we had were really part of the ethos and the framing that made that show possible. Yeah, things are of a moment, and they don't stand in isolation to each other. They're all part of this. The way I think about culture is the way I think about human bodies. Most of the cells that make me up are non-human in origin. Yeah, I am a colony of gut biomes and skin biomes and all sorts of biomes throughout the systems of my body. Other beings are contributing to that. So nothing's happening in isolation. Culture is the same thing. Mythbusters is talking to and responding to all at the same time as any show that is maturing and coming out, and it's the biggest difficulty about a second season of a show, right? Ted Lasso shows up, and Jason Sudeikis didn't think it was going to be this gigantic, loving hit of COVID, which makes the second season, I think, way more difficult to go near because you're like, well, the network wants you to hit that cultural moment again. How do you do that? It's a really interesting question. Lex Luthor says, were your friends and family ever terrified for you when they heard about what you were going to do on the show? Yeah, absolutely. Mostly my wife, my partner. She would get cranky sometimes when I would tell her what I was going to do the next day. The solution is to stop telling them. My mom would call me up after some episodes. My mom is still not allowed to watch the underwater car episode. It's still too upsetting for her, too scary. It's totally reasonable. But when I got my tongue pierced, she called me up. What? You got your tongue pierced? It was more like that. That was more the response. Sometimes I would come home after a story that was really fun or difficult and fun, like Waterslide Wipeout. And at that point, sometimes I would say, well, this part was really difficult and uncomfortable. And, my wife would be like, well, that sounds like it was your problem. That was your experimental design. That was your fault that didn't work out the way you wanted it to. But no, nobody was like, don't do that. But again, we weren't. This question, sorry, were your friends and family ever terrified? It speaks to a level of, by the time I'm telling anybody in my life what I'm about to do, I have already had to sell it to our stunt coordinator, Nick Plachey, who then had to sell it to our insurance company to make sure that we could do it safely. We had already, until that point, talked through every worst case scenario we could think about. And by the way, if you want to have a fun afternoon, start thinking through every worst case scenario of a simple thing that you can, and you can find yourself traveling to some spectacular mental spaces to figure out just how bad things could get. So we had done all of that prognosticating before we got to telling anybody else what we were doing. So we felt very confident in our rigs and our setups by the time we got there. One more? All right. Gandalf the Green. Oh, second question from Gandalf the Green. With Mythbusters being a TV show, there was a significant amount of editing. That's true. Both for time and for telling a decent story. Absolutely true. Are there any memorable myths or stories that the network creatively edited to tell a different story than what happened? Or content that you wished was shown that was cut for time? Mostly what was cut for time, and let me be clear about cut for time. In the US, an hour of television is now 41 and a half minutes. At least it was when I stopped making television. It might be even less now. It used to be 45 minutes, and then it was 44, and then it was 43, and it was 42. It's like more commercials, less television. So the cut to US clock was 41 and a half minutes, I think. The cut to the international clock, like in Australia and England and Canada, they go with a 44 or 46 or even a 50-minute cut, I think. So the first cuts to come from Australia were long. And for some reason, Discovery made the cuts to clock for the US market. And frankly, it's been a long time, so I think I can say this. They did a terrible job of it. The reason they did a terrible job of it was because they didn't seem to have a lot of respect for the jokes. Now, I remember at one point, we were doing a story, and we asked our firearms expert, Frank Tabor, he had owned a gun store down in the South Bay, and he lent many, many firearms to the show over the years. And at one point we called him up and we said, Frank, we need a 44 caliber, we need a 38 caliber pistol. Could you come on Tuesday and bring a couple examples of each? And Frank is a completist. So he brought 60 guns. Literally, his trunk looked like the shot in the movie when the hero's like, oh, it was crazy. He was a former cop. So he spoke cop. So I guess he wasn't worried driving around with a trunk full of 60 firearms. But when he showed up with these, I happened to bead in on this one that was absolutely tiny. It was this little Derringer that was like literally clearly designed by a gun company for a lady. It was like a gun company's idea of a lady pistol. And I picked this gun up and I said, everybody be cool. This is a robbery. A robbery. A robbery. And however I delivered it on set, it was so funny. We were pissing ourselves laughing. It was so funny. And for some reason, that joke got cut in the middle of my sentence for the cut to US clock. Oh, it makes me crazy even today. It was like, cut to Doritos commercial. And it was like, that was my funniest joke in the show. Where did it go? These are the vicissitudes making television. I think by the end, we were Beyond Productions. Our production company was doing the cut to US clock, but only after a lot of fighting. Discovery has its ways of doing things. Every production company, every production has their way of doing things, and it's always a negotiated process. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support us even further, you can by becoming a tested member. Details are, of course, below, but it includes all sorts of perks, and we're building them all the time. You get advanced word and behind-the-scenes photos of some of our projects. Questions, you get to ask direct questions during my live streams, and we have some members-only videos, including the Adam real-time series of unbroken, unedited shots of me working here in the shop. They are weirdly meditative. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you on the next one.